All right, let's jump into this deep dive on the Tavistock Institute. You know, going through this material, especially the stuff from John Coleman, it's pretty intense stuff. He basically claims this organization's been like a puppet master, pulling the strings of world events and shaping how we all think, all to push some pretty unsettling agenda.
Yeah, you got to admit, Coleman's work, it's definitely out there, kind of on the fringe, right? But even if you don't buy everything he says, it definitely gets you thinking about power and influence and, how societies are molded, how things change.
For sure. So Coleman starts his whole journey way back in 1913 at Wellington House in London. He says that's where Tavistock really got going, with the goal of getting the British public on board with World War One. But it wasn't just like, basic wartime propaganda, right?
No, not at all. Coleman says from the very beginning, they were using these really advanced techniques, like polling, for example, and this thing he calls opinion making. It wasn't just about spreading information. It was about like subtly shaping how people saw things, how they thought about stuff.
And he names some pretty big names as being part of all this, right? Like
Yeah.
Edward Bernays, the father of public relations, as they call him, and even Arnold Toynbee, the historian. I mean, if that's true, it's kind of wild to think these influential figures were involved right from the start.
Definitely. And, figures like that, they would have needed some serious cash to make it all happen. Coleman points to some powerful groups, like the British monarchy and the Rothschild family, as being the main money guys behind Tavistock.
Ah, follow the money, right. But what was the point of it all? Why all this effort to, mess with public opinion and get the world involved in a war? This is where things get kind of creepy.
Well, Coleman suggests that even way back then, they had a much bigger plan in mind. He says they took inspiration from a book by Oswald Spengler called The Decline of the West and used it as like a blueprint for how they wanted to change society.
Wait, the decline of the West. So we're talking about purposely trying to bring Western civilization down? That seems pretty extreme, even for a group allegedly involved in, propaganda and social engineering.
Yeah, that's exactly what Coleman's arguing. He says they saw Western civilization as headed for a fall anyway, and they figured, why not speed things up a bit? Clear the way for a new world order, a one world government, that kind of thing.
Okay, now we're getting into some serious conspiracy theory stuff. But even if we play along with that idea for a minute, how would they even go about, collapsing an entire civilization?
Well, Coleman points to a few key strategies. He says they specifically went after traditional values, especially the role of women in society.
Mm.
He argues that they were, intentionally trying to stir up trouble through things like the sexual revolution and the counterculture movement, basically trying to disrupt and dismantle the way things were.
But wouldn't something that drastic, that big of a change, wouldn't that face a ton of pushback? I mean, we're talking about turning centuries of tradition and social norms upside down. How does Coleman explain how they could overcome that kind of resistance?
Well, he says they were incredibly patient and strategic. They were playing the long game. They understood that real change, like deep change, happens gradually over generations. By influencing key institutions and shaping the culture little by little, they could slowly steer society in the direction they wanted.
So it wasn't about quick wins. They were thinking decades, even centuries ahead. It's kind of freaky, isn't it? This idea of a group working behind the scenes, patiently guiding the world towards some predetermined outcome. But Coleman doesn't stop there, does he? He takes this whole Tavistock influence thing to a whole other level.
Right, he does. He claims they didn't just play the long game, they actually actively influenced major world events to speed up their agenda. Stuff like the Bolshevik Revolution, World War II, even the Korean and Vietnam Wars.
Whoa, those are some pretty bold claims. How does Coleman separate, coincidence from actual cause and effect when he's blaming all these massive global events on Tavistock? Is he just connecting the dots without enough evidence?
One of the big criticisms of Coleman's work, he often relies on speculation and circumstantial evidence, which makes it hard to separate fact from his own interpretation. But even if we're skeptical, it still makes you think about what might be going on behind the scenes, the hidden forces shaping our world, right?
Yeah. Let's take the Bolshevik Revolution as an example. Coleman paints this vivid picture of Tavistock's involvement, even saying they arranged for Lenin to be transported from Switzerland to Russia in a sealed train, giving him the resources and support to kick off the revolution. It's a dramatic story, but how much evidence does he actually have to back it up?
He mentions these Wilhelm's trace files as a key source, but he's pretty vague about the details. Some researchers think these files might not even exist. It's one of those things where we need more investigation to know if Coleman's on the right track or not.
So we have this intriguing but kind of shaky claim about the Bolshevik Revolution. But what about World War II? How does Coleman tie Tavistock to that?
He argues that Tavistock played a big part in shaping public opinion, getting people to support the U.S. getting involved. He even points to specific people, like Richard Sorge, who he claims was a Tavistock agent, placed strategically to influence events leading up to Pearl Harbor.
Now it's starting to sound like a spy movie. But
And
again, how much of this is solid evidence and how much is just guesswork?
that's the thing with Coleman. He gives you a lot of interesting information, but it's also hard to tell what's verified and what's just him putting his own spin on things. He's definitely trying to paint a picture of this powerful, secretive organization pulling strings behind the curtain.
Mhm.
But it's up to us, the readers, or in this case, the listeners, to decide how much of that we buy into.
So we've got this alleged global network of influence, manipulating events, and shaping opinions on a massive scale. But how did they actually do it? What were their methods? Coleman suggests they use some pretty advanced psychological techniques, right?
He does. He talks about this thing called long-range penetration, which basically means planting their people in key spots within different institutions like the media, universities, government, you name it. The idea is to influence policy and public perception from within. Pretty sneaky, right?
Yeah, that's pretty underhanded. But how does that actually work in the real world? Got any examples of this long-range penetration thing in action?
Coleman points to how they supposedly infiltrated American academia as a prime example. He says they strategically placed guys like Kurt Lewin, a social psychologist who came up with topological psychology, into important positions within places like Stanford, Wharton, MIT, even the National Institute of Mental Health.
So it wasn't just about spreading propaganda or manipulating events. It was about shaping the way people think, like at a fundamental level. It's starting to feel like one of those dystopian novels.
That's the picture Coleman's painting. He wants us to consider the possibility that our thoughts, our beliefs, even what we want, might be shaped by forces we're not even aware of. It challenges our sense of free will, and it raises some pretty unsettling questions about how our society is really shaped.
Okay, so we've got this alleged global network, these mind-bending psychological techniques, and a long-term plan that's, well, pretty terrifying. But how did all this Tavistock stuff actually play out in America specifically? Was it just limited to universities, or did it spread to other parts of society?
Coleman says their influence reached into almost every corner of American life, from the news we watch to the music we listen to, even how we think about ourselves and our place in the world. He sees their fingerprints on everything from the sexual revolution to the rise of counterculture, even the shift towards a more materialistic, consumer-driven society.
But wouldn't a change that big, that sweeping, wouldn't it face some serious pushback? Were there any people or groups who saw through what Tavistock was allegedly doing and tried to fight back?
Coleman acknowledges that their methods were often subtle and hard to detect. He even suggests that a lot of people involved in these movements, they might have been unwitting pawns, thinking they were acting on their own while unknowingly furthering Tavistock's agenda. It's a scary thought, being manipulated without even realizing it, right?
And that brings us to another big idea in Coleman's work, this concept of identity change. What exactly does he mean by that, and how does it tie into Tavistock's supposed master plan?
That's a great question, and I think it's the perfect spot to pause for now. We've covered a ton of ground already, and this identity change thing, it's a pretty complex idea, deserves its own deep dive.
Yeah, I agree. We've given everyone a lot to think about already. Let's pick up this thread next time and really dig into this whole identity change thing and how it supposedly fits into Tavistock's grand scheme.
Okay, so let's pick up where we left off and really get into this whole identity change thing that Coleman keeps talking about. It's not just about like influencing what people do. It's about changing who they are, how they see themselves, how they see the world, like at their core.
It almost sounds like, I don't know, brainwashing or something, reshaping people's values and beliefs. How could any organization, even one as supposedly powerful as Tavistock, pull that off?
Well, Coleman says it's a subtle process. It happens gradually, almost like a slow drip.
Yeah.
He says they use media, entertainment, even education to shape how we see things. By controlling the stories we're exposed to, they could steer our values and desires in a specific direction.
So it's about controlling the information, making sure the messages people get align with Tavistock's agenda. But wouldn't that take, like, a massive network? How did they get their fingers in so many different pies, so to speak?
It goes back to that long-range penetration idea we talked about. They'd plant their people in key positions within media companies, universities, government agencies, even Hollywood Coleman. argues that many of these folks might not even realize they're part of a bigger plan. They think they're acting on their own, but they're actually pushing Tavistock's goals without even knowing it.
Man, that's a creepy thought, being a pawn in some game you don't even know you're playing. Makes you wonder how much control we really have over our own lives? But let's get back to identity change. What specific examples does Coleman give to support that claim?
He points to big shifts in our culture, like the decline of traditional values, the rise of individualism, and how obsessed we've become with buying stuff.
Hmm.
He sees these as signs that someone's been deliberately trying to reshape who we are, moving us away from self-reliance and toward a more easily controlled mindset.
So he's saying we're being conditioned to be good consumers and obedient citizens, not independent thinkers. That's a pretty depressing thought. But are there other ways to look at these changes? Could some people see these shifts as, I don't know, positive developments?
Absolutely. It's important to remember that there are different perspectives on things. What Coleman sees as a negative, others might see as progress. Like the decline of traditional values could be seen as a move towards more equality and freedom. And the rise of individualism could be seen as celebrating diversity and personal autonomy.
That's a good point. It's a good reminder to consider different viewpoints and not just accept one narrative as the absolute truth. But let's stick with Coleman's theory for a second. If Tavistock was so successful in reshaping our identities, what was the end goal? What kind of society were they trying to build?
According to Coleman, the ultimate goal was a one-world government, a global order controlled by a select few. He says they saw Western civilization, with all its emphasis on individual liberty and democracy, as an obstacle to this goal. By weakening traditional values and creating a more malleable population, they could pave the way for a new global order based on collectivism and centralized control.
That sounds pretty dystopian, but how would they even go about setting up a world government? Did Coleman give any specifics about how that would work?
He's a little vague on the details, but he suggests it would involve gradually transferring power from national governments to international organizations. He points to things like the UN and the European Union as examples of this trend towards global governance. He also argues that technology and globalization, the way they're connecting the world, would make it easier to establish a centralized system of control.
So it's not about a sudden takeover. It's about slowly chipping away at national sovereignty until you have a world where a global elite holds all the power. Pretty unsettling stuff. And it makes you think about the direction our world is going. But before we get too deep into that rabbit hole, let's circle back to Kurt Lewin and his topological psychology. How does that fit into all this talk of social engineering and identity change?
Coleman sees Lewin as a crucial figure in bringing Tavistock's ideas to America and putting them into practice. Remember, Lewin wasn't just some ivory tower academic. He was all about applying his theories to real-world situations, showing how they could be used to influence behavior and get results.
Right. We talked about his work during World War II, using psychology to get people to accept rationing. But how did his methods connect to these bigger goals of social engineering and identity change?
Well, to get that, you got to understand the basic ideas behind topological psychology. Imagine a map not of physical places, but of all the psychological forces that shape our actions. That's basically what Lewin was trying to create, a way to visualize how our behavior is influenced by the social and psychological environment around us.
Okay, so it's not just about what's going on in our heads. It's about all the external pressures and influences that affect the choices we make. But how does that turn into a tool for social engineering?
Well, if you can map out all those psychological forces at work in a given situation, you can start to manipulate them to get the response you want. It's like being an architect of behavior, subtly nudging people towards certain beliefs or actions without them even realizing they're being influenced.
That sounds incredibly powerful and honestly a little scary if it's being used to manipulate people on a large scale. Does Coleman give any specific examples of how this could work in the real world?
Sure, let's say you want to push a certain social agenda, like changing how people view a particular group. Using Lewin's principles, you could create a social environment where positive interactions with that group are encouraged or rewarded, while negative interactions are frowned upon or even punished. Over time, this subtle shaping of the social landscape could lead to a shift in people's perceptions and attitudes, even if they're not consciously aware of what's influencing them.
It's subtle, but it could be really effective. But does Coleman give any specific examples of how Lewin's methods were supposedly used to advance Tavistock's agenda?
He points to Lewin's involvement in developing sensitivity training, which became really popular in businesses and even schools. Coleman argues this was a way to sneak Tavistock's ideas about group dynamics and social control into mainstream institutions, subtly shaping how people interact with each other and see their place in society.
So it's not just about overt propaganda or controlling information. It's about shaping the very fabric of our social interactions, those unspoken rules that guide how we behave and relate to each other. Really subtle, which makes it even more insidious. But Coleman doesn't just focus on Lewin, right? He talks about other techniques Tavistock supposedly used to get what they wanted.
He does. He mentioned something called interdirectional conditioning, which I think is worth exploring a little more.
Interdirectional conditioning sounds interesting. What is that exactly, and how does it fit into this whole social engineering picture?
Think of it as a way to create this, like, self-reinforcing loop of beliefs and behaviors. The idea is that if you expose people to the same messages and experiences over and over again, you can condition them to react in a predictable way.
So you're creating this controlled environment where everything, the information, the social interactions, even the physical surroundings, is designed to reinforce a specific set of beliefs and values. But how does that actually work in practice?
Imagine a community or a social group where certain behaviors are always rewarded while others are met with disapproval or even rejection. Over time, people in that group will learn to conform to those established norms, even if those norms go against their own personal beliefs or inclinations.
It's like peer pressure, right? Creating an environment where people feel like they have to act a certain way to avoid negative consequences.
But does Coleman give any real-world examples of how this interdirectional conditioning thing was used by Tavistock?
He points to the rise of counterculture movements in the 1960s as a prime example. He argues that Tavistock actually encouraged these movements not to promote genuine social change, but to create a controlled setting where they could test out these techniques of social engineering and identity change.
That's a bold claim. It goes against the whole idea of the 60s as a time of rebellion and progress. How does Coleman square his theory with that? He says that while there were definitely genuine elements of activism and idealism within those movements, they were ultimately taken over and manipulated by Tavistock to serve their own agenda. He argues that by encouraging things like drug use and sexual promiscuity, they could create a sense of chaos and breakdown, which would then make people more receptive to their ideas about the need for a new world order.
So it's like a controlled demolition of society, using chaos and upheaval to break down the old structures and then rebuild them according to their own plan. That's a pretty big claim, and it definitely takes some believing. But even if we're skeptical of the details, I think Coleman's work raises some important questions about what shapes our culture and who we are.
I agree. Whether we buy into everything he says or not, his work makes us think critically about the messages we're bombarded with, the social environments we live in, and the forces that might be subtly influencing our perceptions and beliefs.
It reminds us to be careful about what we believe, to question our assumptions, and to be aware of the potential for manipulation, even when it's not obvious. But before we go too far down that road, let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture. What was the overall impact of all this stuff Tavistock supposedly did? Did they actually achieve their goals? And what are the long-term consequences for us today?
Those are big questions, and they lead us into some of the most controversial and mind-blowing parts of Coleman's work. But I think we've covered enough for now. It's a lot to process, and it deserves its own time and space.
I hear you. We've given everyone plenty to chew on already, so let's continue this deep dive next time and really dig into the supposed impact and legacy of Tavistock's operations. We'll explore how their influence might be playing out in the world today.
Okay, so we've talked about all the stuff Tavistock supposedly did, but did they actually get what they wanted? What's the lasting impact of all this alleged social engineering, for us today? That's where things get really tricky. Even if you buy into Coleman's whole premise, that Tavistock had this massive influence, actually measuring what they accomplished with all this supposed social engineering, it's tough. It's like we're talking about these huge, complex systems and changes in society that have tons of different factors involved. So picking apart the specific impact of one organization, it's almost impossible.
Right, it's like trying to figure out which thread started a giant knot. But I'm guessing Coleman has some thoughts on what he sees as the long-term effects of all this, right?
Oh, yeah, he definitely does. He says we're basically living in a world that's been molded by their agenda, even though most people have no clue about it.
Hmm.
He points to things like, how obsessed we are with consumerism, how traditional values have eroded, and the rise of globalism as proof that they succeeded.
So he's saying they've basically achieved a lot of cultural and social control, Even if it's not as in-your-face or centralized as they might have originally planned. Like, they've created a system where we're willingly playing along with our own manipulation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's a big part of what Coleman's arguing. They've gotten so good at this subtle persuasion thing, shaping our desires and beliefs in ways that benefit, the powers that be, but making us feel like we're the ones making the choices.
It's kind of depressing, right? This idea that we're basically living in a carefully crafted illusion. But even if we believe that, what does it mean for us, practically speaking? How does all this alleged Tavistock influence show up in our everyday lives?
Coleman says it's everywhere, from the stuff we watch on TV to the things we buy, even how we talk to each other. He points to the 24/7 news cycle, the constant ads everywhere you look, and how social media is making us more isolated as examples of their influence.
So basically, they've created a system that keeps us distracted, chasing after meaningless stuff, and disconnected from each other and any real sense of purpose. It's like a recipe for apathy, right? Makes it way harder to challenge the way things are.
Right. He says that's exactly the kind of environment they wanted to create. People who are too busy shopping and being entertained to, question the people in charge or demand real change.
That's pretty bleak, man. The idea that we're being lulled into just accepting things while the world changes around us. But is there anything we can do about it? Does Coleman offer any solutions? Like, how do we break free from this system of control?
He does. He's big on critical thinking, doing your own research, and questioning what you're told, especially for the mainstream media and institutions.
So basically, don't just believe everything you hear. Learn to think for yourself. Be skeptical. It's about taking back control and deciding what you believe for yourself.
Yeah, exactly. He also talks about the importance of real human connection, building communities based on shared values, and fostering a sense of purpose that's bigger than just, buying stuff.
So it's not just about waking up as individuals, it's about creating a whole new counterculture. People who are aware of what's going on and actively trying to build a better world.
He thinks that's the only way to really fight back against the system, by creating something new, a network of people dedicated to truth, freedom, and real connection.
That's a pretty hopeful message after all that heavy stuff. Makes you think that even if we've been manipulated, we can still break free and change things, right?
Definitely. The main takeaway here is, once you see the strings, you can start cutting them. Awareness is the first step to freedom.
Well, we've certainly covered a lot in this deep dive. We started with the origins of the Tavistock Institute, then their supposed methods of social engineering, and the huge impact they've allegedly had on the world.
We talked about their supposed involvement in major historical events, how they shape public opinion, and their techniques for subtly manipulating our identities. Pretty wild stuff.
We dug into these controversial concepts like long-range penetration, topological psychology, and interdirectional conditioning, looking at how these methods could be used to influence people and even control entire populations.
And a lot of what we talked about, it's still up for debate and open to interpretation. But one thing's for sure, Coleman's work definitely makes you think about the world differently, question what you're told, and be aware of the things that might be shaping your thoughts and beliefs, even if you don't realize it.
So, where do you go from here? What does all this mean for you listening right now? We've given you one perspective, a glimpse into a world where power works in hidden ways.
It's up to you to decide what resonates with you, what you believe, and what you want to explore further.
This deep dive was just a starting point. There's tons of information out there about Tavistock, social engineering, and the forces that shape our world. If you're interested, keep digging.
Do your own research, check out the sources, and most importantly, come to your own conclusions. The truth is out there, waiting to be discovered.
And with that little bit of mystery, we'll leave you to continue your own deep dive. Keep asking questions, keep exploring, and never stop learning.